So today we're going to discuss the factors that contribute to our workforce pressures and hear from a couple of leaders who have successfully implemented change or analysed what the change needed. We'll signpost you to resources, and we've already done some of that. And at the end, we'll do a 10 or 15 minute Q&A session and ask questions of our expert panel and anyone on the call who wants to jump in and share their expertise and their experiences. But first of all, I just thought it'd be great if we could get to know our audience and colleagues a little bit better. So one by one, if we could all just put our details in the chat box of who we are and where we're working. But I just thought we'd also try and break down why you're coming to these sessions and what the need for your individual organisation is at the moment, because obviously the need and the pressures that someone working in rural Lincolnshire is very different to working in the ivory towers of some of the hospitals in London where you work, Andy. But also, it's understandably, we always think that we need maybe, I don't know, in my organisation, more junior doctors on the respiratory wards. But actually, when we look at the work they do, are we able to break down their role and their responsibilities and look at different innovations for their work? So looking at prescribing pharmacists, ACPs, PAs, where do we want the people to do that work? Is it within hospital? Is it in the community, or is it a mix of those? And so thinking about that and thinking past the obvious, who could we look at recruiting or retaining or training to do some of that role? So try and think about, introduce yourself in the chat box and think why you're here today and what can we as a team help you to do, and what kind of information do we need to help you with. Today, two fantastic speakers, both close ESIS colleagues. I've got these back to front today. Richard's going to start. He's one of our senior improvement managers in ESIS, ex-advanced nurse practitioner and expert on human factors and workforce recruitment and all things demand and capacity. And Chris, I always am amazed by how simply Chris can pass over very complex information and data, which would normally bore a lot of us to tears, but it's very interesting whenever Chris presents, because I learn something new. Is a complete genius in data, as I said earlier. So after we've done our introductions, the first person we're going to hear from is Richard. So I'm going to hand over to you, mate, if that's okay.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll just dispel all the myths about being an expert in anything. And I often say to people, I'm very experienced, which I'm quite happy to say out loud. And experience is just a collection of mistakes that you learn from. So I absolutely have lots of experience, I hope, and we'll go on, no doubt, making mistakes. I suppose what I wanted to kind of share this afternoon, just within a few slides, is not the panacea to workforce solutions, because I don't think anybody has that, but some ideas, methods in their simplest form of trying to get us to think a little bit about the work that we do, the care that we provide, the roles that we have, really to get underneath some of, I suppose, a little bit around workforce design, but also a little bit about just what we kind of take for granted and what we put in a traditional box, and how we might think differently by looking at the work rather than the people. So so hopefully this will be helpful. I think one of the bigger challenges around workforce full stop and improvement generally is the difficulty with being able to have some headspace to look at things. So we're hoping that some of these sessions also just give you a little bit of thinking space, and that's why I'm probably making no major apologies for maybe some of the simplicity of stuff, because if we talk to you and give you really complex things to think about, actually we won't be helping you with that headspace. We'll probably be making it even fuller. So just to kind of create that setting and that context. Can I get the next slide, please, Dan? Perfect. So as I mentioned, just some ideas and principles, some tools and techniques, and some kind of further workforce considerations. Now, some of these slides are animated, so it's going to be an enjoyable journey. Just keep clicking through, but this will be a sync between Dan and myself, hopefully. So I wanted to start with this kind of simple thing. We are talking about hospital early discharge, and I think one of the useful bits is to apply things. So when you talk about workforce, it's such a massive thing, from attraction to recruitment to interviewing to retention. There's so many things involved, it almost becomes overwhelming, and it becomes this phrase that we trot out. We recognise the national challenges, but those challenges are multiple, and some areas will suffer those challenges more than others, and that might be based on all sorts of different things, whether it's geography, blah, blah, blah. So I suppose what I wanted to say is just I've tried to adapt to this for hospital-only discharge, just to give us a bit of context and a sense of where we might look. So if we just press a few clicks down to another one would be great. Okay, so you might have a person who's going home on the ward. You might really have only two destinations. And I appreciate, again, this is simplistic, but stick with me. So there'll be some people on the ward that will be referred to the integrated discharge team or your local service, whatever you call it. There'll be some people who don't need to be referred to the integrated discharge team. And this might be the same as any other kind of binary feature you might have within let's say an outpatient. You would say some need follow-up, some don't. So it's just to try and illustrate the point. And if we just click that through a little bit further, then we might have a situation where if we don't need to refer you to the integrated discharge team at ward level, we might restart your care package. We might ask a kind of third sector or a voluntary sector resource to pop in on you and just check you're okay, or tuck you up in bed. And there may be a decision that there's no support needed because either you've got family support around you, or indeed you're independent and you sort of walk off the ward happily. Just to start thinking about the so what piece, if we just press another 3 or 4 times, you'll see all I've done is started to simply look at some of the options and the demand. So of 10 discharged patients, and I've chosen 10 for a reason, because A, because it's a round number, but B, it's a quick way of doing an audit. So you could take a tool called the last 10 patients tool, and you could look at the last 10 patients who you deemed suitable for discharge, and you could work through what the process was that followed. So out of the 10 that I surveyed, let's say 4 people got referred to the integrated discharge team, 6 didn't need to go to the integrated discharge team. So we can assume that of the 4 that went to the integrated discharge team, from a ward perspective, at that point, we can kind of say we've passed on, we've started that chain over there. Now, that doesn't mean you don't have to revisit it, or there isn't a phone call follow up about something, but just in simple kind of mechanical terms, we're able to quantify that activity. And then from the 6 people that we did need to do something with, 2 needed a restart of package, 1 the Red Cross service, and 3 people didn't need any support. So what that allows us to do is just have a very simple way of dividing the activities or the work or the care we provide, but doing it in a numerically derived way. Now, we'll get to the complexity in a minute, but sometimes you could say on a ward, how long does it take to do something, or what proportion of people leave your ward and go down a certain destination? And we might not have the answer to that because we haven't really looked at it. If you took 10 patients, you may be able to at least make a proxy and decide whether you thought that was a really weird week or a weird sample. But you're now able to say, broadly speaking, you could even say half and half people go through the integrated discharge team, half the people don't. So it starts to just immerse you in your own data. And ultimately, you're the experts of your area, so you can decide whether that data is serving you well and allows you to answer some more of the questions. We just got the next slide, please. So what we might want to ask ourselves is what are the activities that are involved in the people we were talking about at ward level, let's say, where we need to do something from a ward perspective. So we might speak to the family, we might organise follow-up, we might document MDT decision. So these are really breaking it down into tiny tasks. And I appreciate workforce isn't all about tasks, but it is a really useful way of trying to just get rid of the noise and having a look at stuff. And as somebody who's struggled for many years to try and articulate why we need the staffing levels we do, I got to the point where some of this allowed me to explain to people that didn't understand the complexity and the time it takes. It's really easy for somebody to say, can we just get that TTO written and get that patient off the ward? Well, actually, it takes 45 minutes, let's say, with that current computer system and that patient record, and being able to just focus in the space to do that. And that's before we have to find a computer to do it on. So allowing ourselves to be able to articulate why something is more complex is really important. And then we can start to think of ways, are there better ways of simplifying that work? So once we've thought about the activity, we can look at the how much and what, and you can measure it. So you could say, well, let's just watch. When you start writing that discharge letter, if we could measure that, how long would it take? And you might get some of your service management people, you might get your quality improvement team, you might get somebody who's on light duties to help do some of this stuff. You know, it may not matter who's doing it. The person doing it, I guess, can convey the complexity as well as the numerical value. So there's what activities, there's how much of what comes next might be the skills and competences required. And this is where I guess we need to crack the traditional mold and start thinking a little bit more about what is the thing we're actually doing or trying to do, and moving on a further step might be who can do that. So we may well be locked into the fact that prescribing is the domain of the doctor, but of course there are other non-medical prescribers that may do things. It just may fall naturally into, you know, the junior doctor's task list after a ward round. But if that same junior doctor is doing TTO medication, they're responsible for writing the discharge letter, they're responsible for seeing acute and urgent patients in the ED, they're responsible for writing all the stuff up on the ward round. We're now in a position where we've got a single point of failure. And we're also in a position where that individual is only going to get to the next prioritized task at the pace at which they can get to it. So sometimes we're kind of bullying people, I use that in inverted commas, to do things, but the reality is we're not understanding their workload. So I think as a team on a ward, it's really powerful to work out where does the balance sit within workload. And usually the nurse in charge, a ward manager of a ward, in my experience, tends to get the biggest list from an MDT or a board round. So in reality, how are they going to ring 7 families, and how are they going to have a conversation about best interest, and how are they going to organise X and Y all in the next 2 hours? Well, they're not. So I think it just allows us again to be able to ease our own pressure and be fair to ourselves to say we can't do all of that. So how do we as a team in our area make prioritization? So even in the absence of increasing, changing or diversifying the workforce, how can we understand what we can do and perhaps what we might need to deprioritize? And I appreciate that puts the onus on people, but we do that every day now. So how might we think about prioritizing that? Next slide, please. So obviously most wards have a kind of traditional group of people on there. There's a couple missing, they're coming now. We're missing the nurses, I think. There they are. We may well have this group of people, but we may not apportion work equally to them. And you'll have been on wards in places where there's been a CIP program, and the first thing to go is the admin. So what we'll do is we'll get rid of the ward clerks, because that will save us a fortune because there's so many of them. And what you do then is basically strip any essence of clinically protected time from people who need to have that skill deployed to patients. So I think ward clerks and our admin teams, our cleaners, our porters are incredibly important, absolutely essential to what we do. And that's one of the reasons why we need to look at the tasks to look beyond just the clinical team, to think about what support services might we need. And there are examples where some really high volume areas that might be going to a diagnostic area, let's say, may need their own dedicated things like porters, because the time lost for clinicians waiting around in between mean that, again, you delay things and things don't end up where they need to be. Next click, please. Thanks. And just a couple of, I suppose, human factor injects. One would be that interruptions, and it's not really human factors, it's logic, that one, that prolong the time that it takes you to do stuff. And interruptions are really important. That's one of the reasons why, obviously, we try and protect things like drug rounds. The second bit, though, distractions increase the risk of error. And I think we might not see the error there and then on the day, but we forever are investigating complaints, issues, misprescribing. And it isn't the people. It's not the people in the sense that they are daft and incapable. It's often things like distraction. It's often the noise. It's often the number of things that are in your head. So we do need to just remember that within the risks that we're putting into the pot, that the more we distract people, the more there's a risk of creating errors too. So we might want to think about how we protect that as we go through. This is probably just a summary of a few of the things I've said. So you might want to consider demand across your service or whatever work that you do. And then the work inputs and the skills we've talked about. And are there some other untapped roles that we don't yet have? So could you take 3 or 4 of those actions or skills or care functions that you need to fulfill and create, you know, a generic role or somebody that is able to fulfill some of those roles? And are there new roles which can be developed then and you could test, so you could try that out and see whether you can add to somebody? I think the other real thing for me is around the bottom point, which is around what can we do that we just take for granted is a work round, is a bit tricky, is a bit awkward, and is there some real merit in making sure that the ward clerk answers the phone? Do they need a script, which means they won't come every time to bother the clinical team? Do we have electronic handover so that we don't have to be on the phone every time we want to talk to a patient, another member of staff about a patient, whether that's downstream, coming to the ward or leaving the ward? How do we even think about some of those things? How do we have our transfer policy, which means at the hospital level, we don't have to transfer every single patient with a registered nurse if it's not clinically necessary. So let's protect the time we've got. And I think the kind of kindness piece for me is if you see somebody sitting down drinking coffee, it generally doesn't mean that they're not really doing anything. They may well just be looking after their well-being. What we do often suffer from is people will have a momentary snapshot where they'll walk onto a ward, they're trying to push the next discharge and somebody's having coffee, and therefore the narrative is they were just sitting there having coffee. So I suppose there's a kindness factor to me that says if we can articulate what the work is and its complexity and how we tackle that, we're in a better position to try and, I suppose, reduce the risk of people not operating a very just or fair culture. Next slide, please. And this is kind of my final kind of parting piece, which says that if it was dead easy, we'd have done it. But the workforce considerations are multifaceted and can get really convoluted and involved. And part of this programme, we're very happy to help people unravel some of the complexities and have some critical friend thought with you. I suppose some of these things on here just help to reflect where some of the challenges are. And that's probably all I've got to say for now. Thank you for listening.
Excuse me. Thank you for that, Richard. I think that's the perfect start to this work stream and this series of webinars that we've got, because I think you've given us all a lot of food for thought there about how we think about workforce, and it's not just a numerical, we need 5 more geriatricians or need 8 more nurses, although that's obviously part of what we're here to discuss today, but it's thinking more smartly about how our workforce is developed and how it's structured. A couple of things I was thinking while you were talking about that, Richard, is one of the benefits we have as ESIS, isn't it, is going to lots of different hospital sites over the course of the year, and I'm conscious that a lot of people working in organisations don't get the time or the benefit to go and do that. And just some of the things which I'm sure some people on the call will think will be really simple, like transfer policies and things like that. There is so much variation, isn't there, between organisations about how those things work, that I'm sure there'll be lots of people on the call who have these elements of what is actually best practice. They just don't realise it's best practice. So those ACP programmes that are really developed in certain organisations and not in others. So those kind of things, for everyone who's on the call, we'd love to hear more about them. Put them in the chat if you've got some ideas that you've thought of, or that you're doing something which you think could be fantastic to share. But if you have any questions for Richard, hold them a little bit, and then we're going to have that Q&A towards the end of this call. So next, and our speaker is Chris. I've already told everybody earlier when I introduced Chris with a photo that I'm sure is about 15 years old, Chris, that I pulled off the internet. about how much I admire Chris and how much I think he's a genius. But I'm not going to use the word expert again. So I'm going to hand over to Chris, who is our data guru, to present all about his tools and how to go about assessing the demands and the need of our workforce.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks very much, Dan. And that photo was taken a long time ago. That's for sure. I mean, I think it's got to be good 8 or 9 years, I reckon, something like that. Anyway, I slightly digress. So fantastic to see so many people on the call, and good afternoon to everybody. I am sat in an incredibly cold. I didn't get the memo that it's really cold outside, so I'm sat up in London in our office, and it is absolutely freezing. I think they need to put 50p in a meter and charge it up. But never mind. So what I'm going to do this afternoon is I'm just going to talk about 2 main areas. I'm going to talk about the what, and I'm also going to talk about the why. So what I'll do is I'm going to share my screen with some slides on it. If somebody could just give me a nod if they can see that. That should just be coming up very shortly. Can you see that, Dan?
Not yet. Yes, I can. I can see slides in the non-projection style. Yeah, that's it. Perfect.
No worries. Okay. So yeah, so what we're going to look at is just the what and the why. But I wanted to pick up on a point, and I'd like to say I was preemptive about what was said earlier about looking after your staff. I wasn't. I just had more time to go on Google and find the exact quote. But I just kind of want to start off with this. You know, we often think about, you know, we should put pay. Please, by the way, don't say that don't quote me on this. I'm not saying this, right? But that you should always put your patients first. But actually, without your staff, you know, what can you do in terms of delivering high quality care for your patients, whether that's in elective care or emergency care or wherever across the whole NHS. But actually looking after your staff is so important. We've all seen what's been happening over the past couple of years. And, you know, I can't remember who said, I think it was Lee, it might have been saying up in Northampton. But I wasn't technically earwigging. It's not earwigging if they're just in the background. I just heard some other people talking, and they were saying that there's a phenomenal amount of people off with COVID at the moment, or various different things. So it's really, really important to look after your staff. So what we're going to do is we're going to pick up around the what. Now, the what is actually, you know, what can we do about issues around workforce? And I know Richard's done a fantastic job of setting the scene, and he has got a vast amount of experience in a demand capacity workspace. Excuse me. But what I kind of want to talk to it is from a kind of a medical workforce as well. So planning for your workforce is just absolutely essential in terms of delivering safe patient care. And, you know, we've all seen it, and not just over the past couple of years, really, but, you know, I'm a mere whippersnapper with only about 16 years worth of NHS experience. There are people who have got vast amounts more experience than me, but we've all seen episodes where there have just simply not been the right levels of staff in terms of numbers and the different types of levels to deliver the type of care that is needed for our patients. And so what we've got is a series of tools. Rich didn't really go into too much detail about the nursing, but the nursing tool is a fantastic example of something which has been taken from a theoretical standpoint and put into a practical implementation. But we've also got that from a medical workforce as well, or a senior workforce. So the East Emergency Department workforce tool, which I'll talk through in a couple of slides, takes a standardized using the model that looks at 3 different variables. It looks at demand, looks at rotas, and it looks at the productivity, but it also looks at both current and future workforce requirements. And why is it needed? So, you know, we've all been affected in one way or another by what's happened over the recent couple of years. And activity has increased. So we're now seeing significant levels of activity. And I think, Lee, you might have also been talking about activity levels as well. But, you know, activity levels have gone significantly above where we were a couple of years ago, and in fact are kind of way above a pre-pandemic position. But the interesting one for me is not only just about the level of activity, so literally just the number of people that are walking through the front door, but it's how many patients you have at any one time in the department. And that is where all the evidence suggests that is where more harm comes to our patients and poorer outcomes happen for our patients. So about the length of time that, can we see more patients? Well, potentially we can see more patients if there was alternative places for them to go and if there was greater capacity later on in the healthcare. I'm not just talking about the acute provider, but kind of acute and post-acute care. But there's been loads of evidence. There's been a fantastic document written by a good friend of mine, Chris Moulton, around looking at the longer the patients wait in the emergency department, the poorer the outcomes for the patients and the more harm can occur. If you haven't seen that document, I highly recommend it. And in fact, we can probably send out the link to that documentation as well. But let's start off by looking at the basics. And, the thing about the NHS is it's a circular problem. Well, should I say problem or should I say a challenge? Because, they are constant daily challenges for us in the NHS to try and work through some of the flow issues around urgent emergency care. And what we see is we've seen this increase in demand, both in terms of overall activity and the amount of patients who are in the department at any one time. And we'll come on to have a look at that in a minute, because I measure it in two ways, both the amount of patients at midday and at midnight, just so that we can kind of get that difference. But because of this increase in activity and also the increase in patients in the department, what we've then seen is a decrease in the proportion of patients treated within the first 60 minutes, or another way to look at it is obviously an increase in the amount of time it takes from arrival to being seen by a senior decision maker. And then leading on from that, if the patients are in hospital for a lot longer of time, we particularly see this with the older patients coming through the department, is that they have a high propensity to then be admitted because they actually decondition as they're going through the urgent emergency care pathway. However, that also then leads on to a kind of a back end of the hospital. So all the different parts of the hospital beat at different points if we look at it from a kind of a heart rate perspective. But what we can see is that when you see a high rate of admissions, we then start to see an increase in long stay patients. So that broadly looking at the number of patients who occupy beds with a length of stay of 7 and more days, 14 or more days, or 21 and more days. And because we see an increase in that, we also see an increase in overall bed occupancy. But the problem is, this is an absolute classic example of 1 and 1 equals 2, or 1 and 1 and 1 and 1 equals 4, which therefore leads to a problem around the flow in the emergency department, because there simply aren't enough beds in the acute sector or enough capacity in post-acute care. There was some fantastic work done by the NHS economics team in the bottom right-hand corner. If anybody wanted to know does it matter if bed occupancy is slightly higher, because that's just the way it goes. It is some fantastic work around looking at what happens to the 4-hour performance when bed occupancy is at various levels. That goes into a little bit of detail. And once again, we can send out further documentation that has a look at that as well. But if we start to have a look at what I just talked about a couple of minutes ago around activity versus patients in department, you can call it what you will, patients in department, bums on seats, it doesn't really make any difference. But what I just wanted to kind of show you now, this is the same for almost every hospital, I should stress, almost every hospital in the country, but I've selected one as an example just to kind of illustrate the point. But if we had a look, and I've done this for this particular organisation relatively recently, they wanted to know about their levels of activity and whether that has been higher than anybody else. And so if we have a look at their type 1 ED activity, they have seen an increase of 15% year on year. So the most recent quarter compared to the same period the year before, they've seen a 15% increase. Now, actually, looking at the national context, that's not a particularly large increase, because we've gone from a kind of a mid-pandemic position to, I'm going to say it's starting towards the end of the pandemic, fingers crossed, obviously what we've been talking through, but hopefully we are through that. So we are seeing high levels of activity increase in terms of percentage wise. If we look at this this data this time next year, fingers crossed, we are not still going to be seeing double-digit increases in ED activity, because if we are, then we're all in a world of problems. But you might kind of say, well, actually, type 1 ED increase of 15%. You know what? I can probably cope with that with the level of staff I've got. That's absolutely fine. However, if we start to have a look at the total patients in the department, and that has, once again, I measure this by looking at the average number of patients who are in hospital, in the emergency department. Apologies if you just lost me there. If we have a look at the amount of patients in the department at midday or midnight, they have actually increased by 40%. So all that says is, yes, there's been an increase by 15% in terms of total activity, but the rate of growth in our total patients department has far exceeded total activity. So all that's saying is that patients are spending longer in the emergency department. Brutal truth is, yes, if you just looked at activity levels, it would not give you the total understanding of the demand that is being placed on urgent emergency care. And I'd say just in the emergency department, but it's not really, is it? It's across the whole urgent emergency care pathway, the whole system, because at some point or another, these patients have probably contacted a healthcare provider of some description pre that, and they may well require some additional care post the emergency department. So it's really important to understand both the overall activity and the patients in department. Then if we start to move on and kind of focus our attention around the need for looking at workforce, particularly around senior decision makers. Now, the assumption that it might sound like I'm saying, I just want to put this out there that I'm not saying it, but you might look at this graph in isolation and just kind of go, well, it's an ED problem. Okay, this is not an ED problem. This is about the whole urgent emergency care capacity rather than this. However, this is a fantastic example of looking at the variation of time to treatment by hour of arrival. So what we've got here is a graph that shows for the England position, which is the grey line, and then this particular site I was looking at is the black line. The average number of minutes that it takes from arriving to being seen by a senior decision maker. Now, if you arrive just in any hospital in the country as an average, or at this particular hospital, if you arrive in a department at 8 o'clock in the morning, you're going to be seen around 90 minutes. Okay, so that's an hour and a half. You might kind of think, well, you know, that's not too bad. I've got, you know, and particularly from a kind of an operational clinical perspective, you've then still got 2.5 hours to admit, treat or discharge that patient. So that's kind of okay, kind of cope with that. However, if I'm a patient, I've arrived at 2 o'clock in the morning, from a national perspective, I'm seen on average after about 160 minutes. So that's about 2.5 hours. However, in this particular hospital, and once again, this is on average, you are not seen by a senior decision maker until 245 minutes. So you have breached the 4-hour standard even before you have been seen by a decision maker. And then obviously you then got to go on, have investigations, treatments, diagnostic tests, etc., potentially wait for a bed. But the variation is absolutely huge. So we've kind of got that, the two main groups really, haven't we? We've got patients who arrive between 8 in the morning and 4 to 5 o'clock in the afternoon. They are seen relatively quickly, kind of, you know, that 90 to 100 minutes. But if you're a patient arriving anytime after 5 o'clock in the evening and before 8 o'clock in the morning, you are seen substantially longer. Now, I know that that is not necessarily just an ED problem, and also I know that's not necessarily just a workforce issue, because there might be an issue around the physical size of the department, or the fact that SDEC is closed, or the fact that there's no beds in your CDU or assessment areas. However, it does start to lead on to have those discussions around, well, actually, okay, maybe it might be a staffing issue. So that's something we then need to lead on to. So then let's start to have a look around the model. So the easiest senior workforce model is something which I created many moons ago when I was working in a hospital. It's changed a little bit, but actually not massively, because crazy enough that it worked. And what do they say? If it's not broke, don't fix it. There have been a few variations to it through either myself coming up with the idea or somebody else saying, well, it would be great if it could do this. But the broad principles is that it works off 3 variables and only 3 variables. It looks at the demand of patients coming through the front door by time of day, day of week. And we also, bearing in mind what I just said a couple of slides ago, it also looks at patients in the department as well as just the numbers of patients who are arriving in that particular hour. The second variable is the levels of staff that you have, and the staffing can be shown by any staff grades and staff levels that you have. And trust me, I've seen everything. So most people have consultants, middle grades, SHOs, juniors, etc. But I've seen some pretty weird names. The weirdest one was tweenies. I still don't know what that group was. However, you know what? If it worked for that organisation, then fair play to them. But it's very simple to do. And what I will say is that the model is free to use. You can get access to it on our NHS Futures website, and we can also send that out. But those first 2 variables are kind of the relatively straightforward element. The third variable is productivity. So this looks at the amount of patients each staff group can see. Now, this does tend to be a little bit contentious, and mainly because in quite a few of the organisations that I've done this in, they have overstated their productivity. They've wanted to show me that, oh yeah, our staff are fantastic and everybody sees 2 patients per hour and this and that. That's great. But I bet you any money if I put that all of your staff sees 2 patients per hour, it's going to look like you have a surplus of staff. So let's get a bit more real. And what I say to people is it has to be a realistic representation of what's going on in your department. So if your staff see half a patient per hour, put into the model that your staff see half a patient per hour, because that will show you exactly what is going on in your department. But very simply, what will happen is if you've put in the demand, if you've put in your staffing and you've put in the productivity, there's 2 outputs from this. One is a graphical representation, which is shown at the bottom of this slide. And the second is a table, but broadly, they're the same thing. But some people like to see it graphically and some people like to see it numerically. But what it will show you is along the x-axis, you've got each hour of the day, and each hour of the day has got 7 bars representing each day of the week. And then if the bar is below the line, that is where there is a gap in terms of the amount of patients coming into your department and the ability to see those patients. And where there is a bar above the line, it's where there is a quote unquote, a surplus of staff. Now, for this particular organisation, they have a lot of handovers between 4 in the afternoon and 6 in the evening. So that significant surplus is kind of exacerbated by the amount of handovers that happen in that particular time. But they were really interested because they thought they actually had a surplus of staff between the hours of 9 in the morning and midday. But actually, when we put the data into this model and talked about it with them quite intently, that they really understood exactly what was going on and how that meant that their queue times and the amount of patients in the department actually continually built up through that day. So it was really interesting to just take their data, put it into a model, once again, that has been tried and tested by a number of organisations around the country, and put it and shown it in such a way that they can easily understand it, and then have the ability to make changes to any of the rotas from a theoretical perspective and how that change would impact on the amount of patients in the department and what the wait time would be. So that's it from me. I'm happy to take any questions, or otherwise I will hand back over to Dan.
Fantastic, Chris. Thank you. And as I said, I've heard you talk on this topic a few different times, but I've still scribbled down lots of notes there. Just a really simple question before we get to the kind of the Q&A session of the talk, and it's a really simple question with a really impossible answer. Simple question is, Why is it then that when we have an increase in demand in our ED departments that our length of stay goes up? What is the connection, do we think, between them? Is there anything that you've seen in the data? Why does length of stay increase when our emergency departments are busier?
Because there is evidence to suggest that when there is a longer wait in a department and when there are more patients in the department, that conversion rate, so from the proportion of patients that are in the department and then going to be admitted, increases. And so it's just a perpetual cycle. Unfortunately, that is the way it goes. We also see conversion rate significantly vary by time of day as well. So conversion rate is significantly higher overnight. I mean, that stands to reason, doesn't it? Because why would a patient be going into hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning for, I'm going to take this to the nth degree, a cut finger? A patient who goes into the emergency department at 2 o'clock in the morning, you would imagine is more acutely unwell than a patient who goes in at midday. I've made a massive assumption there. However, there is a little bit of data to also back that one up as well.
Thank you. Well, apologies to everybody on the call. I just used kind of chair's prerogative to selfishly ask a question I wanted answered. But now on to our Q&A part of our talk. Richard and Chris are on the call to answer any questions that anybody has. I know there's a few in the chat box that we'll go through as well here. But I'm also really keen to hear from the attendees on the call, especially people like Jenny from Kettering, who's a leader of therapists. We've talked a lot today about how we're assessing demand of doctors and maybe nurses. I do wonder, talking to some of our operational colleagues and our therapists, if you have methods about how you look at the demand and the need of your workforce as well. So please do jump in. Looking at the Q&A, first question I see from Lee at Northampton. I think it's probably towards you, Chris. Is what is the increase in terms of average time spent in the ED at the moment?
That's a good question, Lee. And when I come to you guys on the 12th, we'll go through it on the 15th. That is a good question. We don't tend to look at the average time in department, which is a weird one. We do look at things like APD6. Oh, Leah, you've got your hand up. You might want to go into it a bit more detail.
Yeah. The thing is, though, all the studies show the longer you spend in ED, the more harm you come to. And it is like, so they're spending more time in ED, they're coming to harm, and therefore they're going to have a longer length of stay, aren't they? So it's like the chicken and egg, and it's a bit of a spiral. So I just wondered, what is the increase in the average length spent in ED, and then we should be, is there a correlation to our length of stay?
Yeah. So I am, if you, Richard's got his hand up, I'm hopefully, in a time that Richard takes to speak, going to find you a bit of evidence that backs that up. Richard, please feel free to speak as slowly as you want.
I did that on purpose, Chris. I've been here before when you're trying to build something in the background. I think it's a great question. I suppose there's just a small note of caution, really. So I think what we tend to do is we try and create linear relationships between things, and I suppose I'm drawing a little bit more on the risks and the principles of, do more people come to harm because you've got more people in the department and you can't see the wood for the trees, and therefore it's the occupancy rather than the length of time spent per se. So it might be that's how you're measuring it. So is it the volume of people? Is it the time people are spending there? Is it that actually what we haven't done is we continue to deal with people in the way that we've always dealt with them? There's just more of them. So what we've not done is found enough controls and barriers to mitigate risk. So what we're not doing is maturing our way of assessing risk and holding risk in that area. And that would be of no surprise, considering we started with a baseline of being overwhelmed. So I suppose it's useful to think about a proxy measure, but we probably need to also think about actually what is the harm that's occurring and why, that isn't just about time, because I guess that's where 4 hours worked well in part, but if you can't meet it, you're still running the risks. So what are we doing actually to deal with how we operate to be able to manage risks? Because risks are inherent in every bit of our system. I guess that's just my chip in, but I think it's really useful to have something to get a hold of, but we just have to be cautious about the interpretation of it.
some good stalling that has allowed Chris to do some data analysis in the background. And it's interesting. I completely agree with you there, Richard, about that kind of linear relationship between just time and risk. But it is also interesting that we know this risk, but I wonder if we're communicating that risk to our patients, and how do we communicate that increased risk to our patients, especially with a kind of I understand our responsibility to be open and honest with them. If they're going to spend X amount of days or time or hours more in ED, which is going to convert to X more days on a ward, and not just the risk in ED of decondition of becoming unwell, but of deconditioning over the length of stay as well. I'm just going to give Chris a bit more time, if that's okay. And unless Lee, you have anything else to add, I'm going to come to David, if that's okay.
I do, just on that.
Yeah, go come back in, Lee, before I go into David.
Okay, because this is really interesting, guys, because I could debate this for hours. I love debate. The thing is, though, so we inherently know that the more crowded you are, the longer they're going to stay and the more the risk grows. So, I mean, I can think 2 years ago, pre-COVID, we had 320 a day through our ED, and we'd be like, oh, it's so busy. We've clocked it at 506. But what we're doing now is we are having to do pressure cares on patients in ED. But, you know, we re-looked here where we put patients in the corridor for ambulance offloads and stopped having them on oxygen going in there because they're staying for too long a time. So I think it's indisputable that the risk is absolutely growing. And we are doing our best to mitigate it, but it does feel like you're in a never-ending cycle. It is very, very challenging. I think personally that all pieces of the system should be carrying the risk alongside us, and I think that is actually one of our primary failings. And there's so much focus, isn't there, in the NHS? Everything's punitive, like you had a failed discharge. Oh, someone had a fall on an elderly ward. I'm like, yeah, that means they're getting them up. And okay, one failed discharge out of 100. But it's quite a culture of, if it goes wrong, there's someone to blame, instead of, if it goes wrong, we accept that we're dealing with people, not machines, and sometimes it goes wrong. So I know at NGH we're really trying to develop the culture of, you know, things do go wrong, guys, and it's okay.
Yeah, especially if things are going wrong because you're trying to do the right thing for the patient, like trying to transfer them, trying to keep them mobile, trying to reduce that deconditioning risk as well. I also think it's interesting, Lee, that you gave an example there about kind of pressure care in ED, which brings me back to Richard's talk about kind of doing a bit of process mapping or simplification about what the tasks are within your area, because the task that you just described there is a task that for the vast majority of patients 2 or 3 years ago we weren't needing to do in ED. I'm thinking in my organisation in Nottingham, the fact that people are getting their 2nd and 3rd and 4th dose of antibiotic in ED and their regular medications in ED, and obviously it's never been set up to do that. So if we all kind of are honest about it, have we looked at our workforce from the skills mix and the capacity of them to think about all the new skills and tasks they're having to do that they weren't doing 2 or 3 years ago? But I'm not going to give, as I say, I'd like to sound my own voice too much. I'll keep talking, so I'm going to stop and hand over to David, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Hi, Richard. Nice to see you.
Hi,
hi, Chris. Chris, very nice to finally put name to face. We had a few email exchanges. I think your graph that you showed that had been put together by the NHS economics team, just around the implication of bed occupancy on A&E performance, is really powerful, very poignant. And I'm very keen to get a bit more intelligence from you on that, particularly on some of the conversations we've had via email about our Whittington's bed occupancy. I guess what I'm just intrigued to know is, a similar exercise been done for SDEC? Because I'm just intrigued to know potentially what nationally the implications are being found where there's blocks in SDEC and the implication on ED. I think for us, when that happens, that has maybe a 4 or 5% impact, but I've been intrigued to know, you know, maybe at a national level what that looks like, if that sort of intelligence is out there.
The short answer to that is I don't think there is, but I'm completely with you. I think for a long time, and if people didn't check out my webinar last week, it is available on YouTube. So I did talk about the fact that we look at the sit rep, whether it's a good thing or bad thing. We're not going to go into that, but the sit rep looks at bed occupancy in its entirety. But that's just crap, isn't it? Because the hospital is made up of so many parts. Even if you broke it down to like two main areas, right? And you just went SDEC/short stay and then acute wards, right? But then you've got the three main care groups: medicine, specialty, trauma, and orthopedics. I know women and children's health is very big, so please don't get me wrong about that. But the sit rep needs to go down to that sort of level, because it's all well and good saying, oh, you're 92% bed occupancy, but you might be 105 in medicine, or you might be, or SDEC might be, rammed or whatever. The devil's in the detail. So, so I said that's the short answer. Cool. You really don't want the long one, do you? So yeah, there is that. But I think it's something that definitely needs to be worked on, David, and I will try and push that. I'll chat to the people in the economics team to see whether they've done that.
Okay, thank you very much.
No problem. And that did give me enough time to just answer Lee's question. So let me just share my screen. It's going to look a bit basic. So hopefully people can see that. This is available for any site in any hospital in the country. But what we've got, can people see my screen, by the way?
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay, fab. What we've got is the time in department. So this is how many patients have left the department every 15 minutes. And guess what? If you couldn't see the numbers, you could definitely work out where 4 hours is. So here's your 4 hours. But so the bars are the amount of patients that have left every 15 minutes. And then the line is if that patient has been admitted, how long the patient spends in hospital. So if a patient is in hospital in the emergency department for less than 4 hours, their average length of stay is probably around the 2-day mark. However, breaching the 4-hour standard and progressing even further, you can see that their length of stay pretty much doubles, if not slightly higher than that as well. So it starts to show, well, does it really matter if the patient breaches the 4-hour standard, or does it matter if it's another 15 minutes? The short answer is absolutely yes. I hope that helps, Lee.
That's really interesting, because the only one caveat that obviously is that some people clinically need to be in the ED department for
100%.
longer. I know that all of us would prefer our patients to be managed in a local area, but just in terms of the height of those bar charts, was that the amount of patients then? Obviously,
amount of patients, yeah. The interesting point though, Dan, and bear in mind you're clinical, I'm not. So this is like teaching your grandmother to suck eggs, right? But patients who are really, really acutely unwell, and I'm thinking about broad strokes, as in strokes, acute MIs, fractures, not stuff like that. They have really good clinical pathways to actually kind of say, you don't need to be in ED, boom, go to the cath lab, go to the stroke, go to wherever. So actually that, the 6 hour, 7 hour might be the acute, frail, older person needs a few more tests, needs a few more this, needs a few more of that. And, it builds up, all those, well, yes, we've got to have to run another test. It's only going to take another 20 minutes. Yeah, but then you need to do another one, and that takes 20 minutes. So that's how the cumulative effect happens.
Completely agree. And Lee's comment, I think, is very sensible, that the number in resource for over 4 hours should be very small. And as you describe, with respiratory doctor, we have our own kind of pathway for kind of non-invasive ventilation patients that we hope people are out of the ED department as soon as practically possible. And the neck-FEMA pathway and the stroke and the PCI pathway are really good examples of that.
Yeah.
Excellent. So, guys, I'm just going to share my screen just for the last couple of slides, just to say really thank you for everyone for coming. As you've heard from our fantastic expert speakers, and I am going to keep using that word because Chris and Richard, what was fantastic to hear from you guys again today, is that even Chris during this session, but definitely after the session, is willing to offer you guys assistance and help. So if you need anything, please do look at our YouTube videos and look at our NHS Future site. You can get in touch with us via those websites as well. Our contact details are all on there. The tools that Richard and Chris were talking about, you can kind of look at and play on the NHS website. There is an informatics section on there that Chris has built, and the YouTube videos. If you like listening to Chris's dulcet tones, there's hours and hours of Chris talking about his workforce tools on there as well. So really good resources, especially if you can't sleep tonight. And just as another kind of offer of support as well, these are our improvement managers' email addresses that are linked to the organisations on the left hand side. So if you're in one of those organisations, look to those right hand side in there, and there's our improvement managers for you to email to say, I'd really like Vince, for example, to get in contact with us and to invite Dan, Richard, Chris down to Plymouth for a weekend away, and we'll do some performance and demand and capacity mapping at the same time with you guys. And just as a bit of a plug again, the blue one at the top, the understanding the pressure of the workforce, is what we've just gone through today, and this will be up on our YouTube website by the end of the week. But we've got another 3 webinars over the next 6 to 8 weeks, and there's more information on NHS Future site about the workforce workstream as well. And the last plug from me is, I've just put this in the chat box as well. Please give us feedback. It takes about 2 seconds on the link there. It just allows us to be able to kind of, we've got speakers lined up for the next few sessions, but it just allows us to tailor our future sessions just to what you guys really need to hear from this time, and how best to use your very valuable time, and your time that you should be eating and drinking and stacking up on your caffeine. So thanks again to Chris and Richard. Thank you for coming in and helping us out today. Thank you for all of our participants today, and thanks for people like Lee and anybody for asking questions. Really helpful. Thank you. And have a good day, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.